All of us are familiar with Indian philosophy, a very strong part of Indian history and of Indian mind. In the beginning of this philosophy writing in this book by Abraham Areli, a magician historian I call him, the first spring he calls this. There are few lines in poetry and I would like to read it to you. We need to share poetry with each other, at least to cheer up, to change the gear of our lives to a better mood. Numerous things dear and not dear, sleep, oppression and weariness, delights and pleasures. From where does man bring them? Isn't it beautiful? Whence come distress, depression, decay, mindlessness, and whence come affluence, success, prosperity, thought, and exaltations? And the last two lines, who set in him truth? Who untruth? Whence comes death? Whence the immort? Let's talk about philosophy in India, in ancient India, in classical India. The intellectual scene in early classical India was effervescent, and there were scores of philosophical schools and peripatetic sages and sustained the excitement. Philosophic debates were a mode of popular entertainment in classical India. Would have been a wonderful, enchanting time. In the intervals between the various rites, learned and eloquent Brahmins, desirous of defeating one another, engaged in numerous philosophical debates. It is noted in Mahabharata. It was customary for kings in classical India to arrange debates between distinguished philosophers for the edification of the public. And let me tell you that it was also done in the Mughal period, especially in the times of Akbar. Akbar introduced these debates. They were known as munazara. Ising speaks of a hall in a royal palace where such debates were held, and Huan Song mentions participating in one such debate organized by Harsha. There were at this time public debating halls in most towns, sometimes even in large villages, where regular philosophical disputations were held. The ancient Tamil work Pattinnapalli states that among the many flags advertising various activities in the city of Puhar were the flags of the halls of disputation. Isn't it wonderful that there's a place where people could go and discuss things and enrich each other not only by ideas but by the eloquence of the language and the depth of knowledge. The ancient Tamil work has said it that there were halls for these debates. Unfortunately, out of the many contending philosophical schools of classical India, none of the texts of the heterodox schools, with the exception of Buddhist and Jain texts, have survived into modern times, and we know of their philosophies only from the critical references to them in Orthodox texts. Not to disturb you, but heterodox texts are very, very essential to understand the scope and the depth of an idea. The heterodox texts are lost because Brahmins, the champions of orthodoxy, who had emerged as the sole custodians of learning in the late classical period, neglected to preserve them out of indifference or antipathy. Even in the case of so prominent heterodox system as Buddhism, which was the principal religion of the elite in India for some 8 centuries, very little knowledge of it has survived in India, and many of its texts are extant today, primarily because they were preserved in Buddhist lands outside India. if you think about that, how many schools of philosophies were there? So Orthodox schools were 6, which were formulated over several centuries from around the beginning of the Common Era: Samkhya, dualistic, non-theistic evolutionary theory; Yoga, theory of mind-body discipline for salvation; Vedanta, monistic theory that regards the phenomenal world as illusion; Mimamsa, methodology of Vedic exegesis; and Nyaya, dialectics and epistemology. Very interesting this one is. And Vaishika, atomic theory. The 6 are grouped into 2 classic astika, those based on the authority of the Vedas, Vedanta and Mimamsa. And Nastika, those having no Vedic base, the other 4 system. Whether Astika or Nastika, all the 6 are considered Orthodox system as distinguished from the Heterodox systems such as that of Ajivikas, fatalist, Charvakas, materialist, Buddhist and Jains. The division of Indian philosophical school as orthodox and heterodox has little validity from the purely philosophical point of view, for both groups share many basic ideas, and the differences between the 2 groups are not any greater than the differences between the schools within each group. The orthodox system, in fact, are not orthodox in the ordinary sense of the term, though all of them are commonly associated with the Hindu religion. None of them subscribes to any particular traditional religious view, and all hold vastly divergent views. The Mimamsa and Vedanta, though both are based on Hindu scriptures, interpret the scriptures in entirely contrary ways, and Nyaya and Vasishka do not even have any religious content. So the most striking common characteristic of the Indian philosophical schools is that none of them, neither the orthodox nor the heterodox schools, pay any serious attention to the concept of God, even though all of them except the materialist Charvaka school are considered religious philosophies. Comments Amartya Sen: Sanskrit and Pali have a larger literature in defense of atheism, agnosticism and theological skepticism than any other classical language. You know, Amartya Sen is a Nobel laureate from India. Typically, the Samkhya school views the formation of the world as a result of the natural unfolding of the inherent potential of merit and of matter, which has nothing to do with any God. And for Vedantists, the creation concept is redundant, as they hold that the phenomenal world is an illusion and that gods too are a part of this illusion. Even the theists among Hindus philosophers see God only as a factor, though a crucial factor, in the cosmic evolution as a part of the world and its processes, and not as someone outside who created the world out of nothing. The concept of a creator God would have seemed infantile to Indian sages. Early Aryans conceived gods as anthropomorphic supernatural beings who had to be propitiated or cajoled to show favors to men. But Buddha, Mahavira and other radical sages of the first millennium BCE also entirely ignored the concept of God, and these non-theistic religions and philosophies prevailed among the dominant classes of India for many centuries. In it then came to be held that nature evolves out of its intrinsic potential, and so does the life of each being evolve out of its intrinsic potential, and that the potential of each individual is determined by his karma. Action and reaction, cause and effect follow one another all through life, and from life to life through all the transmigrations of the soul during the entire cosmic cycle. Karma, like a psychic residue, remains attached to a soul all through this process and determines the form, nature and destiny that it would have in its various births. Man has no choice whatever in any of these matters. Individual freedom is an illusion. This concept of karma, very interestingly, has its corollary the concept of samsara, the endless chain of transmigration. Life does not begin with birth nor end with death. The birth of a being is really a rebirth following the death of the same being, perhaps in other life forms in its previous life. And the death of a being leads to the rebirth of the same being, perhaps in another life form. Quizzical? A little different? And this will go on eternally. A few individual souls might exhaust their karma during this process and attain salvation, but the karmic process itself will go on till the end of the cosmic cycle, when the karma of all creatures will be exhausted. There is no beginning or end to this process, unlike the Judeo-Christian concept of the finite cosmic process in linear term, with a specific beginning and a specific end. Indian sages viewed the cosmic process as a ceaseless cycle. Nothing has any finality, ever, and nothing ever remains the same, even for a moment. But the Orthodox Hindu philosophical schools also hold that there is beyond this perpetual flux of the phenomenal world some entity that is eternally unchanging. Buddhism and Jainism hold that there is nothing whatever that is unchanging in the universe. Everything is forever in flux. Another common feature of most Indian philosophical schools, Orthodox as well, Heterodox, is their pervasive pessimism. Life is a misery they all hold, and the misery is endless because life is endless through its ceaseless cycles of transmigrations. But what is the cause of this misery? And how can man escape from misery and attain salvation? This was the problem that preoccupied Indian philosophers, even Buddha, his philosophy of dukkha. The most ingenious and yet also the simplest solution to the problem is provided by the Samkhya and the Vedanta school. They maintain that misery is not real. And so all that one needs to do to be free of misery is to realize that misery is not real. Other schools hold that misery is caused by karma and that the way to attain salvation is to burn out karma in the fire of austerities and ascetic self-torture. That the cure for karmic suffering is self-inflicted suffering. This is because of this pervasive pessimism of Indian sages about the worth of temporal life. They tended to look beyond the phenomenal world to a mystically perceived transcendental world, which to them was more real than the real world. Throughout the history of Indian thought, states Radhakrishnan, the President of India and a philosopher, the ideal of a world behind the ordinary world of human striving has been haunting the Indian race. Unquote. Indian sages generally held that the knowledge of the reality behind our mundane world is the only true knowledge, and this knowledge can be gained only through mystic illumination. Here comes our tasawwuf. Not surprisingly, they generally held empirical studies in disdain and concentrated on grand metaphysical speculations. But metaphysical knowledge is not verifiable knowledge. It has no scientific validity as its source is intuition, not investigation. And it expresses itself in fables, myths and similes, seeking to state in words, is beyond the ken of words. This, scones Radhakrishna, is the metaphysics of metaphors. And Weber commented upon this, the sense of the empirical plain and sober fact was stifled through an essentially rhetorical habituation to the search of the significance and infancy beyond the realm of facts. Another curious feature of Hindu philosophical school is that even though they are all religious philosophies, none of them, unlike the Buddhist and Jain school, place any great emphasis on morality. This is partly because of the transcendental orientation of the Hindu schools and their consequent indifference to the values of temporal life, and partly because of the caste organization of Hindu society.